There we go. Can you all hear me now?
Yeah.
We can hear you.
Yep.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone.
Hello.
It's good to see everyone. I do want to share with you all before we get going on setting our agenda for the day that I was able to very briefly do a three-way call with Rachel and Jill just to get brought up to speed on the couple of meetings you all had after your last monthly meeting in September that I was working with you on. So just to sort of make sure everyone's on the same page, and I know you all also may have teachers and others that are watching, I just want to lay out a little bit of how you got to where you are today, a couple reminders about the process, and then I want to share with you where Rachel and Jill are thinking that tonight you all might put your focus. And it's more of a process focus versus an issue or an item focus, right? So just to clarify for anyone who's sort of listening, this is the first year that I know of that you all have done bargaining or negotiations a little differently. Usually it was traditional negotiations, no facilitator, no mediator, unless you got to impasse. And then you were sort of required to participate in mediation if you know, and then the next step would be fact finding, right? So after you all sort of went through that sort of painfully last year, you all decided to approach bargaining differently this year. You decided to try your hand at what's called interest-based bargaining. And it is bargaining with a facilitator, and I served as that facilitator, and I'm happy to continue to do that. And I'm with Federal Mediation, FMCS. We provide this service to labor and management all around the country. So you all went through 2 4-hour trainings to learn a new way to work as a team to problem solve the issues versus being on opposite teams to fight out or battle out or tug of war the issues, right? So you all did that. I think you had about maybe 8 or 9 sessions starting in May or June. And by July or August, you all ratified your current school year contract. Okay, and so many number of TAs you had related to language. It also outlined, you know, your pay agreement. So you TA'd your current contract through interest-based bargaining, and then that bargaining process ended until next year. And generally next year would start with letter exchanges around March, and then you all wanted to approach it, you know, through IBB again. But what you decided at the end of your last IBB meeting, you decided that there was a lot going on that was requiring you to continue to dialogue, even though the contract was done. The district sort of expressed a willingness or a desire to keep problem solving together, even though it would be not necessarily in a bargaining arena until next year. Just issues that come up. You guys wanted to keep a monthly meeting going just to communicate with each other. I call them labor management meetings, where, you know, issues can be brought forward proactively, right? Where the teachers and the district can be more collaborative on an ongoing basis about sort of unexpected and expected things. And, you know, what we didn't clarify is as you do these monthly meetings between now and when you start your next contract next spring, what happens if you start to sort of stumble into issues that are more appropriate for bargaining, okay? And your last couple meetings you had that were sort of just informal between meetings, between these monthly meetings, there were some issues that came up that started to feel like, for some folks, rightly or wrongly, like, well, should we be bargaining over this? And we haven't exchanged letters and we're not in bargaining yet, but it feels like we might be bargaining, right? So what Rachel and Jill are suggesting tonight is that we revisit a couple things. Number one, throughout the IBB process, you all did start a list of all the things about IBB that you really wanted to capture because they worked well for you, just in terms of process. So that's one thing that we still need to talk about at some point. But sort of more urgently and more important right now is to make sure that this committee is in agreement and has some dialogue, and see if there's consensus around what your monthly meetings between contract time are really about, so that you all can let your constituents, your members, your stakeholders, right, your respective teams outside this room know what these monthly meetings are that they may be hopping into, right? Because the contract's sort of done. So that's where we wanted to spend some focus tonight. Jill and Rachel, I think maybe, did I nail that right?
Yes. Sorry, yes. Yeah.
Do you want to add anything to that?
I thought that was a great summary. Yeah, no, I definitely think that needs to be discussed. I think that, at least on my side of it, for me, I was envisioning IBB when I heard we would meet monthly as like at the bargaining table almost the whole year, and that's kind of what I thought it would be. If you brought like a proposal forward, it would be negotiated. But I know, that's yeah. So on Rachel's end of it, she was talking more about how the negotiated. The Professional Negotiations Act, you exchange notice letters, you start at a certain time. I think that all of this needs to be discussed so that we can be on the same page, so we know, that what process are we using? Are we doing IBB every time and negotiating year round? Are we going to exchange notice letters earlier than March 31st, that kind of thing, so that we're all on the same page?
And I've kind of told Jill as we've been in discussions with Stephanie, I am happy to work at designing something that meets all parties' interests in what our process looks like. I just felt like I had a better idea of what that was prior to our meeting last Monday. I thought we were more on the same page, and then I think that just revealed that, okay, wait, maybe we aren't thinking that this is the same thing, so let's figure out what it is, and then if we need to design something or deal with that March deadline or something, I'm happy to do that legwork.
Yeah, because I think that when something like a mandatory negotiable item comes up and we have some kind of proposal, then we feel like, okay, now we're negotiating that.
Yeah.
And so if we are having these conversations and we're not, or somebody or one side or the other is not ready to negotiate, then we need to have that discussion, because we can't have one side thinking that we are negotiating and the other side thinking we're not.
Yeah.
Right?
Agreed. Yeah.
I think for me, maybe a concern I have or just a thought is, part of this process, whether we're inside negotiation cycle or we're not, the process is, we're going to come together and we're going to collaboratively problem solve. And so to sometimes collaboratively problem solve and sometimes not, I think that, one, our skills are going to break down on how we do that, and it's just not very clear. Like, if it's just this is what we're doing and we're keeping you abreast of it, maybe that needs to go through different channels than this team.
Yeah, and we were talking ahead of time that this process can be used, like if something comes up in different buildings or across a district that is in violation of our negotiated agreement, we would talk about it here, we would try to problem solve it, get it set, and then talk about whether or not if our conversation starts going to where we think we need to add language or change something in the negotiated agreement, do we stop the meeting and put it aside for when we actually, after we exchange notice letters, or do we start coming to a TA now? I think all that process needs to be talked about, right? I just kind of thought that it was year-round, so.
Yeah, I mean, I jump in when you said we're just kind of meeting right now. I was just like, what? That took me aback because I thought that, yeah, we're meeting, but we're also talking and laying out some future stuff, not just meeting to be informed and then start up again in March. I mean, there's a lot of stuff to look at and problem solve throughout the year.
And I think I would just add that, I think it's helpful we're talking about this because we clearly weren't on the same page. Behind this, we have the Kansas Professional Negotiations Act, and that's there no matter what, right? I mean, none of us here made the law. It's just the law that guides how we get to or guides, I guess I would say, the process for getting to a negotiated agreement, and then IBB is a way that you can have those discussions. It's the method for having those discussions. So you have different methods. There's methods other than just traditional bargaining in IBB, and I think we've all said we definitely want to use IBB to have those discussions. It's obviously an effective way to have discussions, so certainly we could use it for other discussion points or problems or concerns that we're talking through, but I do think we have to decide what our schedule is for starting the formal negotiation process, because that has to be triggered under the law by notice letters where we're noticing in compliance with the act. That's the only way that it's triggered. And there's consequences for, once you've started that process, talking about other things that aren't envisioned under the act as being talked about as negotiated items, whereas before that date, you have the freedom to do that.
Olathe manages to do this process year-round, and so does Lawrence. I know Olathe negotiates everything but salary, and they're doing it, they meet every month. I'm just questioning. I mean, they don't just say, we discuss, and then we negotiate all the way through. They function as a they call themselves a professional council. They don't call themselves a negotiations team, but it's the same group of people.
Well, it sort of goes back to Jill, I think, said it most simply. If you all are having discussions that it turns out that those discussions are starting to have you formulate TA and contract language, would that, like right now you guys have a folder. Lindsay and Rachel sort of took some things that were on a wall flip chart that were maybe two issues that you never really got deep into. You just kind of ran out of time and wanted to ratify, and you wanted more info. I'd have to look at those. And what y'all said is you were going to put them in a Google Doc or a folder. One of them, I think, was the grievance process, because that was something you just didn't want to dig into when you were ready to ratify. And then priority standards. So those were two things you did not finish last time, and you put them in a folder that said, so when we look at the next contract and we start bringing our issue statements forward, let's make sure those aren't lost, right? So those will be brought forward. So when you all start to have conversations that turn into something that is more than just, hey, let's do it this way, or hey, let's communicate this to the principals. Hey, let's make sure our teachers know they have this option. Okay, that's just sort of informal working together, communication and working together, right? But if you get into some areas where you're starting to formulate contract language, the question is, do you just go forward and work like that and then have a TA that you hold till next year? Do you go ahead and exchange letters early and make sure that topic is in the letter so you can go forward with negotiations? Or do you hold that topic and put it in that folder that I talked about where you're holding those other two topics? And then decide, do you want to start negotiations after the first of the year? You don't have to wait till March to exchange your letters, right? See what's in that folder. What else you might want to bring forward, right? So it's really just a question of process. And Rachel, if I'm stating wrong, what you said to Jill and I is that I think Rachel's saying the district's hope is this IBB process keeps you from going to impasse. But if there's a hard topic that at some point in the future you don't solve and one part or the other thinks you're at impasse and wants to go to fact finding, but yet you didn't follow the process under the Kansas Professional Negotiating Act, if you didn't follow that process, does it take your rights away to trigger those later steps if you needed them? It would be a long shot, but if you needed them, right? So that's, I think, where the little bit of a concern or obsession is let's not get so, optimistic and just roll with this. If things don't go great around a certain issue at any time in the future, are we making sure that we're still crossing our T's and dotting our I's so that both parties have rights under the act that have to be triggered by formal stuff?
Correct.
And how does it line up with this?
Both
So
parties
that's
will-
really what y'all have to decide. And your timing and what do you do with things that are coming forward as look like they could be contract language?
Correct. Yeah, both parties have rights that they'll want to preserve under the act. So it's really important that we have a meeting of the minds as to when we are having dialogue or discussion and when we've started the negotiations process. And I'd like to have a time period where we can have that open dialogue and discussion, because otherwise there's a break in between and we don't see each other. We haven't functioned as a team. We haven't worked together. Plus, I do think there's a lot of things that could be effectively potentially addressed in this group and in this setting. But that's our interest, that's a district interest. I certainly would like I said, I think there's solutions that could be crafted. I think we need to understand and collect our interests together so we can, as we're supposed to do in IBB, craft a solution around that.
Yeah, I think one thing to consider was, we were talking if there's ever a time throughout the year that we need to discuss a mandatorily negotiable item, or there's an issue that's a mandatorily negotiable item, but we haven't officially exchanged notice letters, how do we deal with that, right? And so in the past, I guess, if needed, we'd sign MOUs. So I think when we had our last couple meetings, and you guys, you had a proposal brought forth that we that we were going to discuss and possibly sign an MOU, I think our impression was that, okay, we're negotiating because we were going to possibly sign an MOU. So I think that we need to talk about that process. If there are things we want to talk about that are, like I said, mandatorily negotiable, but we haven't exchanged notice letters, do we need to first exchange notice letters? So then we're actually negotiating and bargaining before I don't know, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, but that's never been, I'm trying to think in the past, stuff pops up.
Right.
And we need to figure something out, does that mean that we have to rush and throw together a letter to put together? No, we have something that we have to deal, we know that this aspect of that is negotiating.
Well, what did you all do in the past? That's what I was kind of curious about,
We've had an MOU about healthcare before, right? The district offering some more money towards healthcare that we had to do by January 1.
In the past, it has been approached from either the district to the president of NEA-Shawnee Mission.
Right.
Or vice versa. And then that is brought to, we're changing our bylaws for this process because our bylaws do not currently have a negotiations team that meets year-round. We have a process for people applying to be on that team, and that team is selected by the executive board. So anytime we've had any kind of process like that, it's been something that's been informally problem solved between district administration and NEA president, and then brought back, depending on the time of the year, to either our exec board, or if our negotiations team is still intact, that group of people.
I think, and this is maybe just, I'm going to explain my understanding just so that it's out there. I felt like when we decided we were going to meet monthly, we had things like teaching priority standards, grievance, even the negotiations process. It seemed like there was interest on the district's team and that being memorialized within, our P&A, that part of us meeting monthly was we were going to do those things that could be memorialized in the P&A, but we were going to continue doing them. And so I think My confusion is now I feel like I'm hearing, well, we're not gonna talk about anything that's like
Potential.
it potentially gonna be in the P&A until after we notice, and I feel like the understanding I had from the group was we were gonna keep working and we could have a stack of 10 TAs ready to put into next year's P&A when we got to that point.
Well, I mean, I think that is the question. Do you work through and bargain around those and the TAs go into a folder and then you look at the TAs and the non-worked issues and they all get included in the letter and you're just one step ahead on bargaining? Or do you exchange the letter early? I mean, you can brainstorm probably 5 or 6 different scenarios. Can I attempt to put what I think I hear your issue statement to be, you as in the team? I think that this team is chewing on, how do we continue to utilize the IBB process and still be compliant, i.e. not waive rights under the Kansas Professional Negotiations Act? Is that the problem that folks are trying to take on here? And could we go through a list of what's your interest in doing that?
That has been the problem put forth by the district in our first issue letter since we started negotiating for a contract this year. And I didn't, so the team knows we did not anticipate the issues, obviously. I mean, that became evident in our very first meeting. We did not anticipate the way that the NEA team brought forth issues. You probably didn't anticipate the way we brought forth issues. And I made a strategic decision to just, let's get through this first year and then let's talk about it. I mean, I think we could have tried to hash it out then, but we just become a team and we hadn't, got anything under our belts yet. And now I sort of wonder if I should have done that, because now it's got to this place where we've persisted with having different ideas or thoughts about how this has been working, should be working, can work under the Negotiations Act. And so that is the problem as I see it. How can we continue to use the process that we both want to use while complying with and not waiving any rights that either of our the parties that we represent, has under the Negotiations Act? And I do think there's good solutions there. I've just been hesitant to to say them without really understanding what everyone's interests are.
Well, can I say, does the association, do you feel as though that is a problem that you all as an organization see as? Go ahead, Jay.
The problem I have right now is that to me, it feels like that's being held on to as the toes not getting in the pool. Like, I'm gonna keep a hold of this, and I'm not fully in the IBB process. That's what it feels like to me right now, is I'm worried about this and not fully getting in, and it's the fallback of, I'm not sure this is gonna work, so I'm gonna keep a hold of this in case I need it. And that's how it comes across to me, and I'm just kind of was like, I'm still trying to wrap my head around the whole part of like, well, we ended it, and then, okay, step back, and then we're just gonna talk cordially, and then in January, we'll pull back together and try and work through this. That's just.
Hey guys, by the way, if I misspoke and said you're just going to talk, I don't mean you're just going to talk. I'm just saying that when you talk, it's bound to lead to things that may be contractual. So how do you want to make sure that you deal with that?
Yeah.
Right. For me, I'm just as a mediator. I don't represent the district. I'm not a Uniserv rep. Right. I'm not the president. For me, it's as easy as saying, hey, does somebody have a Google Doc for your TAs and the issue statements you're going to want to make sure you tackle this year? For me, it's that easy. Unfortunately, other people in this group feel a bigger responsibility.
And I thought that's what we had agreed to.
Yeah, well,
You know.
I think what we're trying to do from a district perspective is blend the two, right? Where we see the great value that came out of the process that we started in the summer, and we attacked all of those 10 issue statements. And my thinking, as we talked about setting up these monthly meetings, was that would allow us next cycle to work through those ahead of time, right? And have those open discussions and problem solving and things like that, those non-mandatory issues. And then once we got to the negotiations period, we would negotiate. I think, yeah, and I think some of those things that we dealt with, super important. You know, the COVID items that we talked about, I can't remember them all, but a lot of great discussion came out of that and some great actions. I think we would all agree they weren't mandatory, right? But the district had a great interest in talking through those, and that's where I see these meetings serving, is those pieces right there. So we get to those mandatory issues, and we've already done the work of the other interest.
I think a struggle I'm having is I feel like I leave these meetings feeling like I really understand where we're going. And then the next time we meet, I feel like I'm hearing the exact opposite. And then I hear, oh, I'm sorry you didn't understand, which that is really frustrating to me because it's like we meet and we're on the same page. Then the next time we meet, it's like, no, that's not what we said. Or a few times later, no, that's not what we said. You didn't understand. And like, I'm going to give it the great possibility that I didn't understand. But when it's time after time after time after time, I'm like, I feel like I'm smarter than that. That like, I'm not just like sitting in these meetings like somehow misunderstanding everything that's happening. And so I think that's really frustrating. My second frustration is I keep hearing, well, this isn't mandatorily negotiable, but we talked about it anyway. There are things that are mandatorily negotiable. Talking about stipends for teachers who are moving is compensation. That is a mandatorily negotiable topic. So I don't feel like this isn't working as a team if every time we talk about something, we hear, well, but it's not mandatorily negotiable. Okay, but are we not here for what's good for teachers, what's good for the district, what's good for kids? We are. Some of those things aren't going to be in the Professional Negotiations Act, but we got to do them anyway. And so if we are going to constantly say it's not mandatorily negotiable, then as a team, do you want the NEA team to say, well, but that's negotiable, that's mandatorily negotiable, that's mandatorily negotiable? That feels shitty. And we're supposed to be on the same team.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, I want to honor your feelings, Lindsay, because they're your feelings. I don't know if, here's what I'm feeling. I think the same could be said for our side too, right? I don't know if it's fair I think we're operating in good faith. I really do. I think both sides are. And I think it could equally be said that we're confused, right? I mean, we had an opinion too, right? I mean, this is what we thought. We thought we were having these problem-solving meetings and not going through deep, formal negotiations. So I just don't want anyone to get the impression that the district is not operating in good faith and wanting to be a part of this process, because we certainly are.
Right, and I think that the last time when we invited those elementary teachers, or when you reached out and asked us to bring elementary teachers, that's good. We want to hear from the people that it's going to affect the most. We want to hear their ideas on how we can make their transition better. And then with the proposal of a stipend, I think in our minds we thought, okay, so we're going to negotiate this now. And then but I think on your side, maybe you thought that that was your proposal, and then we were going to come back on Monday, and it was going to be, good to go. And so I think that's where our misunderstanding happened, is that we were thinking we would be negotiating. And so I think that there are things you say that you'll talk about, like the grievance process and the priority standards, because those were noticed last year, but it seems that maybe when it comes to, a stipend or something monetary, that's when you might pull back and want to wait until March, when we exchange notice letters.
And I would just add that, a couple of things. I'm going to start with just by being very upfront that we did not think we were negotiating the stipend. And I'll share the thinking why a little bit, because we felt like we were meeting the hourly rate in the negotiated agreement for work outside of the school day, right? So I can't remember the calculations, but just for round numbers.
2308, I think.
But for
Anyway.
20 hours.
Sure.
So we were like, well, that would equal this. It would be a whole lot easier if we gave a stipend instead of people having to do a time card, da, 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 da. So we really felt like we were kind of going above and beyond that because we were offering more in the stipend than 20 hours at the hourly rate, right? So with that being said, we were like, well, let's make sure we're not missing something. Do they still want a sub day? And that's why we wanted the voice of the teachers. So we were sort of, I'm going to be honest, I was sort of dumbfounded that we're offering more than we're obligated in the P&A. We didn't feel like we were negotiating it because we weren't trying to negotiate something different. We were actually, well, I guess we were trying to negotiate more, not negotiate, we were trying to offer more that was in the P&A, and then it felt like that wasn't good enough, and it honestly, to me, it felt like it slammed right back in our faces. I mean, that's how I personally felt. I'll speak for myself and not the whole team on this, but I was really dumbfounded by it. I was shocked that we're offering more than we contractually have to, and it wasn't enough. And so that was frustrating. But I definitely, and I kept saying, are we negotiating? We shouldn't, why are we negotiating? We're not trying to change the P&A right here. If we want to change the P&A to talk about when a teacher moves, then let's table that and let's negotiate that. I mean, I think it's negotiable. But I think we weren't negotiating new language for the contract. We weren't negotiating a new rate for the contract. So that was where I was coming from. Right, wrong, indifferent, that's just where I was coming from. And I really appreciated the teachers coming and giving input. And I think we should do more of that, quite frankly. Because as good as we may or may not be, we don't represent everybody in this district. And so I think it's good to have people coming in and telling us input. Especially when they're willing to show their face and they're willing to say their name. I think that's very powerful. That's so much more powerful to me than an anonymous survey. Again, I'm speaking for myself right now, but I think it is important to meet the letter of the law, obviously. And I think the other thing that I don't know how to find the balance here, but we can only table so many items a year. Each side can only table so many items a year. Rachel, help me, what's the statute? 3?
So we get compensation, hours and amounts of work, and then 3 from the list of terms and conditions.
So we should only be tabling 5 things each.
Well,
That's
here's
what I
my
hear.
question. What if there's more than one issue that's under hours and amounts of work? Do you know what I'm saying? We can only have one single issue that falls under hours and amounts of work? Do you know what I mean? Like, that's, I think, where our confusion on that, too.
Right, so the way, and Lindsay, I'm gonna go back to your comment. It does suck. Like, I did not write the law. The Professional Negotiations Act, walking through it, it's uncomfortable. I mean, there's a reason why people use attorneys at these things, because it's a statutory framework that we have to learn to operate on, and IBB can't substitute it. You can't, say, well, we're not doing that because it's awkward and it makes us take positions on things. It's there. We have to deal with it. I think that there's ways that we can say, we're going to talk about this without trying to deal with it, but then if we have to, let's have a method for dealing with it. Let me think where I was going with this.
Well, I think that Jill was talking about the categories. The way my perception is, the districts that are doing IBB, when they exchange letters, they view those categories as sort of umbrella categories. And most districts that are doing IBB, they deal with more than one issue under each of those sort of umbrella categories.
For compensation and hours and amounts of work, yes. I mean, there can be, for example, compensation includes things like stipends, right? There's multi-components of compensation, and potentially there could be for hours and amounts of work too. The other 3, there's not. And of course, that's just there because you have a time constraint on negotiations, and that's kind of one of those rules of fair play they have in the statute, right? Each side gets the same number, that way no side has an unfair advantage. So, I mean, unfortunately, it's there. And IBB is just the way, to me, IBB is the way you get through that discussion and you get to the end. And instead of saying, here's our offer, okay, hit back at that, here's our second offer, it allows you to have a discussion of the why behind all of that and see if there can be a solution. As Stephanie always said, rather than coming forward with what you want, coming forward with the problem that you're trying to solve. And so,
Can I ask, the other night when you all got input from teachers, and it sounds like it was very valuable, but then did it turn into the input turned out to just be sort of a teacher proposal of a solution? And that's why you thought it seemed like bargaining, Michelle? I mean, did it just formulate to where, like, tell me how that, like, did you all, did you say a couple things? Number one, more than one person has said it felt like negotiations. Did it feel like traditional negotiations? Did it feel like something in between? Or did it feel like you guys brainstormed solutions with a larger group than this and then couldn't agree on which solution? Like, in other words, where was your break? Because what I'm finding that it sounds as though you all are committed to the IBB process for problem solving, right? What's the problem? Why do we care? And what are some ways to solve it? But you're interacting with a larger group of folks that haven't been part of putting that process in action. So maybe it's getting shortcut where proposals are getting made that aren't really coming through the IBB process. And then you're feeling frustrated, with this process. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't there to see how the proposals came about.
I don't know how you can say we aren't negotiating if we need an MOU.
Are you talking to me, Jay?
I'm just saying as a whole is when we're talking like, well, we weren't negotiating. Well, then if we weren't negotiating, then we don't need an MOU at the end.
I think the MOU from our perspective was just that we all
Memorialize.
recognize this is an issue. Here's what we want to, we all kind of agreed to, which clearly we didn't. So, and maybe that's where the breakdown was. Maybe we shouldn't have done a MOU. Maybe we shouldn't.
Yeah, I think.
It sounds like you all were doing bargaining. If you got as far as talking about dollar amounts, and there was even a discussion about a need for an MOU, it sounds like you were just doing bargaining, but it wasn't IBB, it wasn't traditional. It was just,
I think we got
know.
comfortable.
And
with part
maybe
of
some
it.
things that started to come into play might have been power.
Yeah, so Thursday, when all those teachers, the elementary teachers were there, they just expressed what it was going to be like for a transition, if you had to move from being a remote to in person, or move a classroom, or move a building, and things that might help them
How they were
transition,
affected.
right? And so then we had a proposal on the amount of, what a stipend would be, and like you said,
And where
based
did that
on the hourly
proposal come?
rate.
Where did that proposal come from, Jill?
And we brought that up, but from our perspective, it was more about trying to make it easier and
Sure.
trying to make it less, I mean, nobody wanted to move 23 teachers. Nobody, right? And nobody wanted to ask teachers to change grade levels after school had already started. So we recognize, I mean, it wasn't a great situation for anybody. And so we were just trying to, how can we support them? How, what ease of why do people have to turn a time card in, right? And so we were trying to make it easy. And so we had come up with this dollar amount to say, here it is. But again, at the end of the day, the dollar amount that we ended up with, that we were going to pay, was more than the daily rate in the PNA, or the hourly rate, sorry, in the PNA. And so from our perspective, it was like, we're going above and beyond. But clearly it wasn't
So maybe
perceived that way.
the way
which-
to put it forth, maybe what you meant to, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if you had said, we're going to do what we've done in the past and pay these teachers an hourly rate for this many hours, and then maybe on our side, it wouldn't have seemed like a proposal?
Well,
Do you know what I mean?
And I think, as I think back about our conversations, I think it was in an effort to be super transparent and
Right.
honor this process and to get feedback from teachers. And so as we met with them on that Thursday, some might need a sub, some may not,
Right.
some want to have the buddy time. And so then again, as we brainstormed, is let's give them all of it, right?
Sure.
So that they have all of those options. I don't think at any point did we think that it was a back and forth about dollar amount or anything
Okay.
like that, because frankly, we weren't obligated to do that. It was just trying to honor this this group. And
We
to
thought it was gonna be a
and
big
to-
victory for this group. I
and
mean,
to be
it stung,
super
you guys, to
transparent,
be
right?
honest.
I
It
mean-
stung bad. It did not feel good.
Well,
I think for any.
So guys, when you say, Mike, when you say you guys brainstormed and you decided to do blank, who brainstormed?
It was executive leadership team. I mean, we talked
Okay.
about it, and so it was, well, what have we done in the past, and is that enough? And as Dr. Hubbard said, none of us wanted to do this, not the stipend or anything, but to move teachers, right? And so we wanted to make sure that, is this about the right amount of support that we need?
And what are we not thinking of?
Right, what are we not thinking of?
But can you guys see how, you guys are like, what do you guys need? We need more information. We provide more information, and you're like, oh, that's a great idea. We want to take this piece, we want to take this piece. Like, that feels like we're problem solving together to come up with a joint solution. And so then to say, oh, we're not negotiating, like, on our end, that's where the confusion comes from, is like, you wanted us to help you problem solve, you guys wanted, like, our input, but, like, only to a point. And so I think, like, there was never the point where you're like, this is, like, the money's the money, but we want to, like, make this better, but, like, so for
Yeah.
me, I think like, kind of IB being with us, but then kind of not on some parts of it makes it really confusing for us, because we assume if you start out kind of IB being with us, you're gonna.
That it's going to stay in this arena.
I do-
So you went so far as a whole group together, and then it sounds like the executive team ended up selecting some solutions they felt would be a good thing, but they weren't selected with this group. They were sort of selected outside this
Yeah.
group.
No.
And
Yeah,
then,
I misrepresented
and
what
then-
happened. So we brainstormed a solution ahead of time, then we met with the teachers, got some additional feedback, and then we came back together and we decided, let's give them all of what they asked for. And Lindsay, I absolutely understand the confusion. I guess I would say, the only thing that I heard on that meeting that went south, frankly, it was just about dollar amount. It wasn't about support. It was, it was the hours we agreed upon. It was just, well, how much are those hours going to be worth? And that's where we weren't at. We weren't negotiating. The dollar amount is established by the negotiated agreement. So, and maybe, it was a complete disconnect, clearly, because we were completely caught off guard, and so were you guys. So
I think in the future, we're probably not going to fix that issue, right? I mean, it is what it is. Unfortunately, we can't go back and change it. But I think what we need to figure out is when it's a conversation and when it's negotiating. And I strongly feel like both of those things should happen in this room. I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Lindsay, but I hear you saying that you don't think both of those things should happen in this room. So I think as a team collectively, we need to go to our norms maybe and say, can we just have collaborative conversations when in the end it's not negotiating? And one team or the other may just have to make a decision and the other team live with it? Because sometimes that happens. Or are we saying, no, the only thing that happens in this room is IBB negotiating? Because that changes what comes to the table. Just in all fairness, that changes what comes to the table and comes to the room.
And I thought what we heard come out of, frankly, since I've been with the district, is we want to be heard. We want to be listened to. We want to have a voice in decisions. We want to, talk about things that aren't necessarily contractual issues. And so we're saying we're willing to create the time and space for that. I think from the Professional Negotiations Act perspective, we have to be really careful, because obviously look at what happened from not being on the same page as to whether we were negotiating or not. I do think we have to have a start date for negotiating, and that we can talk about when that is, what makes sense for us and our schedule, because that's the procedural operation of the act.
I don't think I'm saying that conversations can't happen at this table. I think that conversations and problem solving can happen at this table. What I feel like I'm hearing is that conversations can happen at this table in between cycles, but anything that is could potentially become a TA is not going to happen between cycles. And I don't think that that's where the groups under, or, you know, maybe just mine, I should say that, was that these monthly meetings were going to end up with. I felt like, you know, the negotiations process, I felt like was something, like Rachel, you really wanted memorialized in the P&A. And I feel like you.
Or an
and-
MOU
and
somewhere.
So if we're saying that it needs to be memorialized in the P&A or in an MOU, that's negotiating. And so by what I'm hearing you say is we shouldn't be talking about that during our monthly meetings because we're not negotiating right now.
I think one thing
Oh.
that,
No.
I think,
I would say, like, I don't think, has any, people, I'm hearing everyone raise concerns. I'm hoping no one is stating positions or drawing lines in the sand. I'm hearing concerns, and we have to know what we're doing, and we have to have a process that we all understand, or we're going to continue to trip over each other like we did last time. But I think that if people are starting to hear positions and lines in the sand, I hope we're not there. I'm not IBBing this. Let me give you a couple observations. Number one, I think that more than you guys know, perhaps you as a group relied upon a lot of structure in IBB. You relied upon that structure, right? When you weren't using that structure, it feels like trust got eroded pretty quickly. It feels like without the structure of sharing interest and coming to consensus on the problem and interest, some and bad intentions were assumed, right? Not that there were bad intentions, but they were assumed, right? It sounds as though, I think if you guys could look back, the way that the whole situation was handled, I'm sure you could think about things you could have done differently. But you're right, you can't take it back, but you can think about it in order to go forward. And the question is not really, do you have conversations or do you don't? I think the questions is, if you're having conversations that result in a contractual solution and you haven't entered exchange letters, do you want to exchange letters early? Do you want to put the conversation as far as you want to take it, but then stick it in a folder so it gets brought up as an issue statement that's already solved for when you do start doing TAs, right? Do you want to say you're just going to hold the issue if it's not urgent, right? So you guys have a lot of ways to brainstorm solutions without where you're heading. You're heading as though either we talk about problems between times or we don't. Those aren't a lot of options, right? I think I've been hearing a lot of other creative options come forward, but you guys seem to be wanting to a little bit box each other in. Hey, you're on this side and they're on this side. I don't think you are. I think everyone's open to some creative brainstorming around the question of how do we continue to utilize IBB to problem solve, and that problem solve could be, contract problem solve or not, but how do we make sure that we're compliant or consistent or not waiving rights under the act? Now, if the NEA doesn't feel as though that's a problem they feel like they have an interest in, we need to talk about that. The district probably needs to be real specific about why you have an interest in that, because I think people are assuming, like Jay said, he says it feels like, you're just kind of, keeping that in your pocket, or you don't trust the process. So we can IBB out that question and then brainstorm solutions right now, because it feels like you guys are just going to go back and forth on assuming each other's position when I don't think anyone has really put a line in the sand on position.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to talk about interests.
Yes.
If we agree to talk about this issue, I think we need to talk about interests, understand what each other's interests are. And again, just going back to, I have full faith that I can craft something that is workable. But I need to hear what those things are.
and I think in one of the things I think has to happen in that language is that when we start to talk about an issue, I think up front we need to be very clear about where we're headed.
Yeah.
Are we negotiating an item that could be in the P&A, or are we simply having a discussion, or are we problem-solving a solution? Because, I don't know, there's times I would love to come to this, I mean, Linda and I have these conversations a lot. We had one this week where, I mean, I'm just gonna be honest, Linda, here we go. So, we were both frustrated, without question. I mean, we were both extremely frustrated, and probably both with good reason. I mean, Linda's like, I've never done this before. I said, I've never done this before. You know, it's just where we were. So we beat it up, we hashed it out, and at the end of the day, we came to a solution. We both had to give on the solution. It was fine. But it also was something that had to happen in 24 hours. It's not something that we could talk about for 2 months. And had we not been able to come to a solution in 24 hours, ultimately, I would have had to make a decision. I mean, there's just some situations like that, right? Fortunately, we were able to come to a common ground that we both could agree with and run with. But I think up front, we have to say what we're doing.
Dr. Hubbard, I think there will be times that's possible. I think there are going to be times you don't know where you're going with the problem until you get to zoning in on some solutions. And you're going to start to then say, but that solution would require contract language, or that solution would not, right? I mean, ideally, identifying upfront would be great.
Well, and
But I would
maybe,
recommend that everybody keep some flexibility, that if you identify upfront, you're going to limit your solutions.
and maybe time-sensitive issues just have to go to Linda. I mean, maybe that's something that we have to, maybe that's part of our process here. Because I think that's what got us in trouble a couple weeks ago, is that it was extremely time-sensitive.
Well, and I do think that by that nature, issues come up all the time that are not, the goal is not to change contract language.
Right.
The goal is to discuss, COVID's a perfect example. There are things that contract never conceived of, but they're just conversations I will bring to Michelle and Dr. Fulton many times. These are concerns I'm hearing from buildings. I need some clarification because I can't provide the answers. I'm not the person that would have that. Or in the case of what we worked on this week, this is what I brought to Michelle. This is what I need. And Michelle was initially like, I can't give that to you. And then we figured out a way to figure out how to solve that problem. It's nothing that's ever going to see the P&A, ever, because it's an issue. Things that we deal with are issues that
Procedures sometimes.
procedure, and usually it's mutual interest. I think the district wants to know what the concerns are from teachers and certified staff, and as an organization, NEA-Shawnee Mission wants to know the thinking behind what the district is doing, and not to question that, but just to say, hey, to be able to support or provide further clarification, I need to know what the intent is behind that. You can't do that in an IB. I agree, you can't do that in an IBB process because most of these things are time sensitive. So I think what I'm thinking is there are issues that we talked about that are not mandatorily negotiable last year, like BLTs. That it would be nice, I thought we were going to come, and professional development and evaluating it and how that was going, that those are the issues that come back perhaps in the fall to say, where are we on these issues? So that as you begin to formulate your letter,
I agree.
as you begin to formulate your letters to do maybe that formal IBB process in the spring, you've continued to dialogue and research and work out to subcommittees who can provide that information to you so that you have a feeling of, hey, we have enough information so that when we try to problem solve this spring, we're ready to go on some of these issues. Not that we've resolved a lot of issues through that, but we've figured out what are the questions are that we're going to have to investigate so that IBB process can be more streamlined and be more effective in the spring.
I think also, hindsight, this is one of those things where we assumed some things, and I think going into it, being clear and saying, you know what, we want to get feedback on this. The executive team wants to make a decision on how we're going to handle this, and we're using this as feedback, and be very clear about that versus the fact that we felt like we were working as a team to do it. And I think, you know, and just retrospectively, if it would have come, we listened to your feedback, the executive team wants to do this to make it easier on teachers, that's very different than feeling like we're sitting here negotiating about something.
I don't disagree, Jay. And that's why I think being upfront, when the issue comes to the table, we say why we're talking about the issue and kind of where we're headed with it. That's what I was saying earlier. We were
Yeah.
definitely on the same page with that.
Okay.
That makes sense.
So I guess where do we start then to get into, I mean, should we talk about interest, Stephanie, or?
Well, I mean,
Kind of circling the
couple
solution
things,
now, but.
I don't I'm going to err on the side of not letting some things that I may think are obvious, let me not just assume. I want to say a couple things. First of all, with what Jay said, thinking back what Lindsay said, what Dr. Hubbard just said, it does feel as though, you know, I mean, I think if I could paraphrase, Lindsay was saying, we're with you, we're in this, we're doing the work with you, we're sharing, we think we're part of a team. And then it's like, you know, the final decision, if you will, which wasn't turned out to be final, but then you're taking the information outside of here and working as a team, right, without us, right? So that is really probably the core of some trust issues here, right? So I feel like now we do have to really identify a pretty good process here so that that doesn't continue to happen just accidentally, right? I don't even think it was an intention, but just accidentally, right? So we definitely need to identify and make some decisions around this, and some ideas are coming forward. I want to say that. But I also want to remind everybody, and maybe it was just my perception as facilitator, and I'm reading between lines, but Rachel, when you brought forward the issue statement from the district that said you want to, memorialize whatever it said about negotiation process, right? You want to, we can look at the issue statement. It was something basically where in the very first meeting, you wanted everyone to dissect how is this going to look? And in the very first meeting, you shared with us some of the things that are being said now. There's letters to exchange, there's the act we have to follow, what if we get to impasse? And what we all did, right or wrong, is like we all said, hey, let's actually just go through IBB and we'll be more informed to visit that issue statement at the end of the process. And what I probably facilitated or morphed that into is what about IBB is working and what are the things that are not. And we had that folder. Rachel or Lindsay would take notes and say, oh yeah, put that in the need to do, or we like this about IBB. What I've sort of failed to do, and maybe I've sort of brushed it under the rug, and now I think, Rachel, you're re-raising it, is the original issue statement probably wasn't to, best practices for IBB. I think Rachel is revisiting the initial issue statement that we never really picked up and dealt with here. Can I be quiet and Rachel see if I maybe nailed that right in retrospect? And do we want to look at the issue statement in light of the statement that I had just put together around the process?
Yeah. I mean, I feel a little bit, it's like now we're going through an issue, even though we don't, I think it's sort of our formative thing that we need to go through. And maybe if we had gone through it, even though we hadn't started IBB, we wouldn't have had somewhat divergent views of, what we're doing. Because, even just the basic issue of the schedule, right? Like, okay, so what are we doing from these August to March meetings? We've never picked up on that. We never addressed that. So I don't even know where to find. I'm sure it's in our shared folder somewhere.
It's in the,
John, Russell, I know you guys didn't have a whole lot to say. Did you guys want to jump in here anywhere? Any insight here as really good listeners right
I was
now?
under the same impression as Jill and Lindsay I thought we were going to be continuing talking about issue statements that, that we left at the end of our agreement, and July, so I'm with them. That's where my head was at.
The process notes that you made, Rachel, are in the 2020-21 folder, and
Okay,
it's SMSD2 negotiations process notes.
yeah.
And then
Okay.
also, if someone can pull the original issue statement that came from the district on process. Russell, do you have any thoughts, any words of wisdom here for us as we look to go forward on this?
No, I really don't have anything to add. It just sounds like we need to work through this issue statement and get something in line that we can go forward, quit rehashing the past, and let's work together as a team and get a plan in place to go forward.
Yes, it's SMSD2, and I look through this and it's like, we've had discussions about some of these, but the issue statement is the problem the board would like to address is that the P&A does not include and is silent on an agreed upon negotiation process, including the scheduling of meetings, the use of the IBB method, meeting protocols and norms, resolving disagreements about the negotiability of noticed items, joint statements, which we've been doing and been working well, written proposals, similar components of the negotiation process. I mean, to me, I don't want to, again, I wrote this without ever having gone through IBB, and this includes the solution in it, which is language in the P&A, right? So I would write it differently today.
So within that are some ideas for solutions, right? You've got some problems, some interests, some ideas for solutions all in that list. Would you say that the issue statement that you guys are talking a lot about the symptoms of just problems you're having right now, right? But I don't want to confuse the problems you're having right now with the work we need to do, right? Just having a process will fix some of these agreed upon process. But if we said, so how do we continue to utilize the IBB process to problem solve collaboratively, right? Interest-based bargaining, IBB is bargaining, right? To problem solve collaboratively, and still be compliant and not waive rights under the Kansas Professional Negotiations Act? Is that the problem? Or can someone else take a shot at saying, I'll type while you talk, saying what the problem we need to solve right now is?
That's how I would put it.
It's pretty technical. Anyone else?
I don't want to
And
reinvent
does-
the wheel. I think if there are some groups around that are currently doing this model, that maybe we should ask to see how they have formalized that. I'm all about stealing
yeah.
ideas.
That's what we do as attorneys. I literally just take someone else's language and make it my own.
It's like
The group that's
I don't know
around
if
the
they do,
clock right
though.
now
I mean-
didn't formalize what it is. They just use their meetings sort of as needed. And no, really what they've, it's sort of, they're sort of seem to be getting into some TAs at this point. I think they just have an unspoken thing that they were using their meetings for a lot of COVID conversations for the last 2 months. And then now it feels as though they're starting to have the space and time now to go back to issues that weren't resolved last contract cycle and start to work towards TAs. They don't have a formal identification of what they do between contracts when they meet. That group maybe is further in the process by a year than you all. But I don't know of any group in my world, in my turf, that is doing ongoing IBB that has a formal statement around it.
Does Olathe with their professional counsel?
Who's doing do they use facilitation? Does Linda know? Because I don't have Olathe. I don't have Olathe School District, and it would be Commissioner Albano, and I'm not sure if he's facilitating them. Olathe may have just gotten to the point in IBB that it's morphed into a process of their own, maybe?
Yeah, I don't think they use a facilitator. They've used it this is my 6th year in my office, and they've been doing it well before that. And it's made up of members of the the superintendent's on it, and members of district leadership, I think human resources, and an associate superintendent. And then I think Olathe's NEA president serves on that, and then they have bargaining team members. And what they do, and this is just from knowing really well and officing next door to the Olathe NEA president, but they meet to, they do a lot of things collaboratively in NEA-Shawnee Mission that are programming and such. So they meet towards those things, but I also think they are identifying issues, non-financial generally, that they work on throughout the years they come up to. And not everything is for language. It's just
Right.
to be a collaborative, problem-solving group that meets on mutually agreeable issues. I'm sure we could find out more from Olathe. That's just
Does it sound like
secondhand
a
knowledge.
broader than the IBB?
I would suspect, and I don't know, because I don't, I mean, I would suspect that they have an understanding of when negotiations is starting, right? Like, so,
I believe that, well, I know they exchange, I'm not sure their process for notice letters. I know they don't stick to they start early. They don't wait till March to exchange notice letters. Sometimes they
Yeah,
have to
that's
wait
how my
on
district-
compensation
that's
if you're
why
waiting on the
they just-
legislature.
see, and we could do
So,
that, but
Linda,
again,
do you
we
know
want
who
to
their
have a mutual.
Uniserv rep is?
What?
What was the question?
Who's their NEA rep?
Their NEA president is Leanne Rogers.
No, I mean like their NEA staff person?
Oh, H.J. Highstand.
Oh, okay, I don't know who that is.
Actually, it's an interesting process to, I don't think they define it per se as IBB with a with a facilitator, but they've been doing it for so many years. There's incredible buy-in because it's, last year, 2 years ago, they negotiated a 2-year agreement, and I think they have that more frequently than a lot of other locals do around here.
Well, I mean, I don't know if Rachel, if you know who their sort of HR or counsel is that might be able to sort of dialogue with you about how they thought about or think about this question.
I'm not
that-
sure they have counsel involved in theirs. But, I mean, certainly we can go out and see after we know interests. I mean, I think we need to start with interest, right? Like, I feel like we keep jumping to solutions, and I can't even begin to think what might fit our interests until I know what they are.
Right. Well, I'm right now sort of when you think about if we're going to IBB this problem, the issue statement is where we're at right now,
Yeah.
right? And then interest, right? And then some ideas on problem solving.
Yeah.
So the issue statement I just read says, and I can screen share, but because I mean, I wrote it and I don't want it to be like just Rachel's issue statement, right? If people are already identifying problems that have come up without a solution to the concern, then give me your issue statement, right? But I have, how do we continue to utilize the IBB process to problem solve collaboratively and still be compliant, not waive rights under the Kansas Professional Negotiations Act? Does anyone think that there's a different issue statement before we move on to any interest? If not, Rachel, do you want to, anyone want to say what would your interest be in doing this?
Well, I mean, I think our starting point, joint interest, was very much together, which was creating a forum to, exchange information and solve problems that come up during the school year, so that they can be solved timely and they don't persist. And so I think that would be one that we've had, and then also keep our team together so we know each other and have a working relationship.
So Rachel, I didn't have the word year round. I probably, what you just said in your interest, I need to add that. So how do we continue to utilize the IBB process year round to problem solve collaboratively and still be compliant? Mm-hmm. Okay. So your first interest in that would be ongoing communication?
Yeah, that'd be great.
And then I did not hear the second one that you said. I'm sorry.
It's kind of in line with that. Keep us as a functioning team.
Yeah. I know in the past, it's kind of felt like if we don't have our first meeting till the end of May or June, and then we're trying to get everybody's schedules together and, you know, trying to get as much done in the short number of meetings that we have. So I think year-round definitely would help.
Can I say that's kind of reducing stressful, jam-packed agendas?
Sure.
Well, and it's, for our team, it becomes a logistical nightmare to try and schedule that many meetings for that length of time in the summer.
Sure.
Because
yeah,
we
for
all
of
have to
us.
take vacations at different times to ensure that we have coverage. And I frankly think the only reason we got this many in this summer was because everybody's vacations got canceled because of COVID.
Well, yeah, I don't think COVID and stress of right now is really helping the learning curve either.
No.
I'm struggling with the issue statement, and maybe it's just me, and
Yeah.
if I need to get
And I
past it,
think
I will.
we can go backwards on it, yes.
I struggle with IBB, the Kansas Professional Negotiations Act, and collaborative problem solving all being there together. Because I think it takes us back to where we were. Are we problem solving or are we negotiating?
I think we can
Well,
do both.
in IBB, they are the same.
I guess, are we problem solving for mutual agreement on a solution? Or are we negotiating for the PNA?
I guess I think we're going to do both. I think there's going to be some times when we don't put in language and sometimes when we do. I think in here, I think we're going to eventually talk about what happens when we get to a conversation that starts to lead into contract language.
I'm still,
I get what you're saying, Michelle. I get what you're saying.
I'm struggling with, are there situations when I bring something or our team brings something to this group just for feedback? Because if they're not, we need to know that up front.
I think that's a clear of what happened last time. I
Without
think-
question.
And I think that's when it has to be clear up front that we need to use this time to get feedback from your side about these issues. And I think that's just kind of we're making a left turn and we need to accurately signal it versus like we're meeting as a team and we're gonna try and problem solve this.
Or should we get feedback not during our monthly IBB meeting and get feedback from
Right.
you know, our rep council group or
that's
something
a
like that, so that we
Yeah.
can use
You
our
guys are
IBB
coming-
time to talk
you're-
about, looking back at BLT and how's that going, looking back at the staff meetings and, you know, and the, what are we doing? I can't think of, evaluation, you know, of each one.
Surveys. Yeah.
Like the things that we said we were going to look back on.
Because I don't want to set us up for something that's hard feelings. And I look back at my emails, I use the word feedback, right, when I emailed Jill, but we weren't on the same, you know, again, we did not have a meeting of the minds going into that. That was clearly that's the word I used when when we asked and invited and said, let's stop what we're doing and let's instead hear from teachers right now because of what's happening is time sensitive.
Right.
So I guess maybe that's the question about what is our interest here? Is our interest only?
For me,
Yeah.
this interest statement says we're bargaining all the time.
Yeah.
And I'm okay with that. I just need to make sure we're all clear on that.
Well, I think we need to establish define some nomenclature here. Like, to me, maybe to you, Dr. Hubbard, problem solving is not bargaining. It's just kind of dialogue around an issue, and perhaps we reach an agreement, like with your example with Linda. But
But there might be times we don't.
There might be times we don't, right.
It's almost like we need to take out IBB. How do we problem solve year round or something like that?
Or we leave IBB. And I mean, I like Jill's, I guess in
Right.
situations,
Guys, you if you all just keep communicating, you'll get down to where you need to be. I'm trying to capture what I'm hearing you say. And keep in mind, all this can be changed. We go forward and backwards in the process. So at this point, I'm just putting some sub things under the issue statement, right? When we think about the Kansas Professional Negotiations Act, that's about bargaining appropriate issues, giving proper notice to enable you to trigger rights if you need them, right? But separate from that, you're talking about allowing communication for perhaps non-negotiable items, right? So I'm just trying to capture what you say, and then maybe you could make sense of it. Because the interests you identified are more about, a need to continue to meet. You're right, not necessarily IBB, not necessarily bargain, but maybe, right? And I'm going to go ahead and start the list for brainstorms. Jill started with the first one, do monthly meetings separate from IBB, right? So whatever order you want to talk, I'm going to try to capture what you come up with, and maybe then you'll have something to look at.
I think as part of the act, I think an interest would be ensuring fair play on both sides, ensuring that there's equal amount of items that are being discussed once we're into the negotiations process.
I agree. Once in the process, if we set up a time that's for open dialogue before, I think we can, be more flexible, because that's it's just not negotiations.
I do have to add, though, that the side in power typically won't ever have as many issues as the side that's not necessarily the one in power. And I'm going to use in power because the district's the employer, that we're and I think that if we're locked into there can only be equal amounts, that's not a logical, like, that's tying our hands.
I think more for, I might be speaking out of turn here, but more for me versus, rather than saying equal, I would also say manageable. That we can't, we could all manipulate the system if we wanted to and take our 5 items and have 10 under each one for a total of 50, right? That's not manageable in the time frame that we have. So maybe it's a limited number. We already have a limited things we can table, but maybe we only limit so many under each of those as well.
But
people could argue that the statute, how the statute reads. People can argue that no, it's the 2 items plus the 3, period. And then other people can, I don't think the statute's very clear to say.
The statute was written clearly to tie the hands of the teachers in bringing stuff. If we look at the history when the statute was written, it was written by the legislator to take power away from.
And we could argue all day long about problems in this. People do argue all day long. There's been requests for legislative changes, and we could argue all day long, but it's, that's the compromise that the legislature struck, and now, unless amended, it's the backdrop that we have.
I guess I would just say we need to make it manageable so that we're not spending days and days and hours and hours and hours doing multitude of items.
And the act does have a way to bring in additional items, but there has to be an agreement from the other side, and that agreement, to me, for the district, would relate to manageability, and are we getting into management rights issues? So it says at the very end of that section about terms and conditions, and anything else that the parties mutually agree to. And so we'd have to have a discussion at the outset of, okay, well, you've noticed these 2 things plus these 3 things, and you've added that you like these other things. And then we'd have a discussion about that. Are we going to agree to negotiate or not on those things? And I think, again, it would be smart for us to set up a process where those kinds of things could go outside of the formal negotiation timeframe, and instead be in our problem-solving timeframe.
I think interest. Go ahead, sorry.
Go ahead, Stephanie. I was just going to say, as facilitator, when I give directions at the end of your second day of training of any district's goal, or at the end of training, IBB training, and I give out the issue statements. As a facilitator, never have I asked either party to limit. And then what comes in everywhere tends to be a little more from the association than from the district, right? And I think that in any industry at negotiations, because I do a lot of mediation outside of education and even outside of public sector, it's generally the union, the association, or the employees that bring more items forward. And it may be because management generally just has some basic rights that they can implement anytime, right? So they don't have to bring, sort of everything to the bargaining table, right? Because they're sort of running the environment, if you will. So right or wrong, that's generally more from the union side, right? But I've never limited either side. And then if you remember what we did, and what I always have you all do in the first negotiating session is we go through and start to categorize. We start to see where there's duplication. We start to see where there's related proposals. And then we sort of create those, buckets, separating the economic from the non. Then we say, okay, well, you've only set, 7 or 8 times to meet. And you say you want to have a contract by July. So reasonably, where do you want to start? What are the most important? What are the ones you're able to bite off right now? And then you just see what you get through. And then I don't think there's like this expectation that every single thing get dealt with. What happens is some stuff doesn't get dealt with, right? And it either carries over or through the process, you realize it got settled already in some other way, or it is no longer a priority, right? So this idea of like, coming up with the amount of issue statements that you want to bring forward is something that you all could decide to do as a group, but understand what your interest is. And then that idea of bringing only a certain number of things forward is just a brainstormed idea, right? Because the statute allows the parties to mutually agree to look at more, right? So
Stephanie?
in other words, I don't want your statute language to dictate your decisions if there are some alternatives, right? If the concern is we can't take on 30 issues every time, we don't have that type of time. Okay, so what are your ideas around not taking on 30 issues? One idea is to limit, right? What are other ideas? Prioritize, what are other ideas? So try to stay in the spirit of IBB, guys, or somehow at the end of this conversation, you guys are not going to come to consensus, or some people are going to leave here feeling not real good about the solution.
So Stephanie, I do
is
think
my
we need to
recommendation.
get some clarification as to how IBB meshes with the act, because what you just said, I think, what I heard kind of flies in the face of the act a little bit. Because the act basically says there's 5 issues, right? And those are the 5 issues that each side gets. And what we experienced in the summer, and what I think I heard you suggest now, is that there is no limit. And so I'm wondering, from your perspective, or maybe from the team's perspective, what does the notice letter do? Does the notice letter do anything at all?
Yeah, and I can't give you the legal advice. What I say to NEA is talk to your council, and then districts either talk with their council or do whatever makes sense for them. But what my understanding is that the topics that are identified in your letter, generally when you approach IBB and you don't know what all is going to be brought forward, the topics you identify in your letter tend to be umbrella topics. And like if Rachel read out those topics, you could see where probably most issue statements that you brought forward fall somewhere under them. But Rachel, you may have a more stringent view on that, and you are counsel, so I'm going to defer to you. But other clients tend to see those sort of 3 topics as umbrella topics with some things that fall under them.
I think that's what, every year that we've negotiated, whether it's when I was in another district or here, a lot of things fall under hours and amounts of work. So there might be 5 issues, but they would all fall under, mandatorily negotiable hours and amounts of work. You know, and when we did our notice letters, you know, we sit down and we do those with Kevin. You know, and we go through, where would this fall? Where, you know, how do we write out our notice letter? How do we do those things? And, you know, justify where that would place. And so I think for me personally, my interest would be that we're not limiting the number of issues, statements that a team could bring forward. Because, you know, I think as part of good faith, we're trusting that you guys are having those conversations of where does that fall in a notice letter, mandatorily negotiable, permissibly negotiable, just like we are. We don't just sit down and have, you know, here's 50 problems, let's throw them at them.
So the reason why you have that notice letter is to give fair notice and an opportunity for the other party to understand what it is from compensation, hours, and amounts of work, and terms and conditions of professional service the other side is noticing, so you can prepare and plan, but also so that if you don't agree that it's something that the other side has to negotiate under the act, you have an opportunity to raise that. And so, you know, I think we should probably then, I think there's an interest in defining what our notice letters do, because I would like to see the things that Lindsay outlined in terms of we're noticing up this as a form of the contract issue. I mean, that's how we did our notice letter. We went through and identified those things as a new item or an item already in the P&A, you know, and then we broke down our 2+3 into issue statements, but they still fell, I mean, they were still within the notice that we provided in our letter. And so I think an interest, Stephanie, that your discussion sort of overlooked is that from a Board of Education standpoint, there is an interest in not falling into a pit where you have implicitly agreed to negotiate something that is not mandatorily negotiable and is on the management right side under the act. And I mean, again, there's a way we can, you know, come up with a process there, but if you get sloppy about it and, you know, get relaxed, then that's the pit that you fall into is, okay, well, now we're so out of bounds of what this was that was noticed. And in terms of hours and amounts of work, again, both sides should have an opportunity. You don't just put hours and amounts of work. Well, what are we talking about? What are those things that you want to talk about?
We don't just put hours and amounts of work. We
We usually bullet it out.
We bullet it out and like, so that you guys know exactly what we're coming to the table to talk about. And we've done that for years.
So
But we didn't open notice letters. So, you know, we didn't open notice letters last year. And so it was like, you know, where were we? You know, what were we? What was this topic or item?
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look, but I definitely, we may be totally getting off base here, but I feel like the letter didn't match the 12 or 13 issue statements.
Well, can I make just I hear what you're saying, Rachel, and I think we're not as far apart as we think. I think there are issues that the association would like to bring to the district and talk about, and perhaps we can begin to come up with solutions, which we did last year that didn't result in language when it came to, like I said, professional development. And if you can deal with those issues that already, you know, are out there now, and the ultimate goal is not necessarily to get contract language, it's can we come to a solution that doesn't require a contract. That means we have to wait until the whole negotiation process is through. So I think that's what we have to figure out here is I hear what you're saying, and I think we're in agreement too. Nobody wants to spend June, July, and August going through 15 issues, but which of those issues could we start talking about now? Because what we really want to do is see if there's some place else in the district or subcommittees or people that can come up with problems or decide that that's going to be a building resolved issue, or it's just going to be something that, hey, professional development maybe is something we should be talking about all the time. You know, what's working, what's not, what did we like? Let's memorialize this just so when everybody in the room's gone, we know, hey, back in 2020, we tried this, it worked, this is the thought behind it.
Yes, and I mean, obviously, our discussions around that went very well, where your team members were like, hey, we get it, this is BLT or whatever. But the problem is that when we do it while we're in formal negotiations, the district is implicitly agreeing to negotiate on that issue, which ends up, if we don't reach an agreement and we go to impasse, then that now becomes something we have to negotiate. That is where my level of discomfort in what my inartful term of sloppiness is coming around in, and why I would like to create a time period for all of those things. And then this window where we're like, hey, now we're talking about compensation plus any terms and conditions or hours and amounts of work that has a financial component. Now we're in formal negotiations, still having our discussions the same format we have them. But the district's going to have a lot more freedom to talk about those other things when we're not under the umbrella of formal negotiations. That is where I'm just trying to explain my interest statement of where my nervousness as the district's attorney in protecting their rights under the act comes from when we do it in formal negotiations, and why I became kind of itchy when we started to open up issues and I didn't have a notice letter to match it up with to say, okay, what term and condition do they think this thing falls under? Because I totally got the message that we're not trying to get you to put language in the P&A, but if we do it under formal negotiations and then hit impasse, which hopefully we don't have that happen in the short term, now it's an impasse issue. And so I don't want to be in a place, I would like to avoid really doing, I have thought of this great solution in my mind that sort of talks about the things where maybe during the year, maybe we solve all sorts of things during the year. We sit down in March and we say, hey, we've got compensation, we've got hours and amounts of work, and you know what, we don't have any more issues, guys, 0 on both sides. Or we each got one thing that we think falls under this category. It's a form of contract, or it's a leave issue, or whatever. And then we do that, and we know that we're gonna have time things on compensation, because there's gonna be information that you gotta have before we can do that. But then we close negotiations, and then we move on to our informal process.
Yeah, and I think.
Something like that.
Sure. Yeah, I think, so like, for example of BLT, if we started discussing it now and we hadn't exchanged notice letters.
Right.
We could get all the way to a point where some of us might think, you know what, maybe we do want language around this. So then we decide to put that in our notice letter, and then you know what I mean?
As a new item.
Right.
Because that would be a new item, if that's what the solution was. I would never forgo, okay, hey, guy, and this goes back to your comment earlier, Lindsay, I would never say, oh, well, we've reached a solution and it happens to be changed in the contract language, so, nope, we're not going forward. I would not do that. But so you guys know, in my legal mind, when we're in formal negotiations, that's something different. There's constraints and there's consequences to the discussions we have during that time frame. And I don't want to be constrained, and I don't want to have to pull that trigger of like, well, I don't want to be I'm very fearful of being the bad guy on this team. Because, okay, well, this was identified as not mandatory, and they won't talk about it. They won't listen to us. So I want to maybe there's going to be a day where we have to do that, but I'd like to have a system that avoids that.
And I felt that's where we were in July when we tabled those ones, to continue those conversations throughout the school year. I thought that was the purpose of doing that, but then obviously COVID concerns,
Right.
which we do have some concerns still, kind of
Yeah.
taken over with the start of the school year. And so those have been tabled even longer.
Right. So, I feel like if I could know that in representing the board, I'm not formally negotiating, meaning I'm not Kansas Professional Negotiation Act negotiating, right? I'm not IBB negotiating, but I'm not Kansas Professional Negotiations Act negotiating until we've got to that point. That resolves some of the sort of district interest / concerns that I have.
So the reason I have not yet taken out IBB process, how do we utilize IBB year-round to solve collaboratively? I haven't taken that out of the issue statement because I think that there is still a possibility to brainstorm a process that lets you do this, right? But I'm just going to bring you back to what I've captured so far. how do we use IBB to problem solve year round and still not waive rights, right? And be compliant. But it sounds as though like this is a lot, and you may not end up having a solution where you do it in IBB, but you want to bargain over appropriate issues and give proper notice to enable and protect your rights, but also allow communication and problem solving on non-negotiable issues. So I think maybe that allowing communication and problem solving on non-negotiable issues maybe is part of the issue statement. I don't know. And then here's the interest I heard you guys say. You want to do this because you want ongoing communication. You want to maintain a functioning team. You want to reduce stressful, jam-packed agendas. I think this one we have to really tease out. I don't totally get it. You want to ensure fair play once you're in the process. Does that mean an equal amount of issues? You want to recognize that you have time constraints. I heard protect management rights. I heard protect teachers' rights. I heard another interest, and this is what I think Rachel sort of keeps going back to, is the freedom to talk about issues that may not be mandatory while not implicitly agreeing to negotiate over something that's not mandatory, right? So that's a lot of interest to say we want to be able to do all that and address all these interests in this meeting up here, right? And then here where we're lacking a little bit on brainstorming and solutions, and that's okay because you're still talking things through. You're framing and focusing the issue. Solutions I've heard so far is hold monthly meetings that are separate from IBB, limit the number of issues that come forward, agree on how to do notice letters. Both of you guys sort of play by the same rules fairly consistently, right? Fairly and consistently. And then one that Dr. Hubbard had that I didn't include in here was, identify if it's negotiable or not up front, identify the type of issue up front in these monthly meetings. Negotiable, non-negotiable, whatever. So I just want to tell you where you guys are in this process, not to rush you or to push you down to brainstorm. Your talking is helpful right now. So that's just what I've captured so far.
I think it needs to
And I think it's
identify-
okay to hold meetings separate from IBB, but I also don't want you to build a separate culture based on old ways, based on power, or based on quid pro quo. Because you guys will get used to doing that outside of IBB, and IBB will be hard to stick to. Doesn't mean you can't do separate meetings, but just you're gonna have to be conscious. But anyway, go ahead.
What I was saying is, not necessarily not negotiable, but classified as, I don't know, like the feedback part of, yeah. Because it's not whether or not it's negotiable, it's just how we're addressing it. Because that's gonna stick things up in the mud. And then I'm gonna be that guy and say it's 5. I think we've had some good discussions. There's no way we're gonna finish this right now. That we need to.
Well, did I capture it right that, maybe it's not negotiable or just not addressed via contract? Mm-hmm. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm just saying it's labeling it versus like, are we negotiating this, or are we trying to just figure it out and get some feedback for the outside or whatever,
Yeah.
Not,
You said it there, where you say identify the type of issue up front. That's what we're saying, right?
yeah, because I think that, that was the biggest hiccup we had last time was that it wasn't identified or understood, identified, whatever on each side, and we were going at it 2 different ways, and that's what led to the cluster.
Well, and ultimately you're now saying like, was it conversation or was it proposal? Truth is, a proposal in IBB should really be an idea. Right? Right. A proposal is your issue statement, but when you get down to brainstorming is really where you start pulling together what your solution is. So I just added, basically are you bringing contract language forward or just dialogue and sharing, right?
Yeah, because I mean, that's a perfect example of leading up to the last one with the teachers involved was we need the feedback for the executive to come up with a plan on how they want to handle this, and that we're not negotiating that part of it. We are wanting to use this time for feedback of the teachers that are affected, utilize that feedback loop that we have access to.
Right.
And just
Can I ask-
generally avoiding our
did-
professional
well,
employees feeling like they're not listened to, having a venue for that. I mean, that was a big part in the administration's push for IVB is like, when you hear repeatedly, despite your what you think are your very best efforts to constantly be listening to your staff, and that's what your whole job is focused on, but what you hear back repeatedly from feedback is you don't listen and you don't care. Well, we want to set up something that expressly shows that we are actively listening and we do care, and that's very visible to our professional employees. Because it's one thing to not agree on something, but it's another thing to just feel like you didn't even allow the discussion to happen.
Oh, yeah, I think creating the space to hear works both ways for teachers to hear, a district's perspective and vice versa. Do be careful that it's not coming off as, condescending or I don't want to use the word patriotic, is that the word? In other words, where we will listen and then we'll go decide and tell you what we decide, right? So, and I think that's where Lindsay was coming from. It's like, I'm sure that the folks from the association on this team are encouraging teachers to turn a new leaf. Don't be skeptical, participate, come forward. We're working together now. So they're going to be really sensitive. Lindsay and the folks on this team are going to be really sensitive to making sure that teachers know that it's a real thing. It's a real process. You guys are just, it would be crazy if you didn't have hiccups. So do not beat yourselves up. You're right. Be kind to yourself and to each other, because if you didn't have hiccups, it would mean you are not growing in this process. Okay. So in terms of wrap up, I'm open to suggestions. I am going to send what I've typed because it feels like people could probably just think on this for a little bit, and then maybe come back together with a clearer head on how this all starts to formulate into a solution that might make sense. I know that today, if we didn't use this whole hour and 45 minutes on this, there were some other COVID concerns that I know some folks on the team said they wanted to bring forward. So how do you guys where do you want to go from here? And when are you together again?
I think the concerns we were talking about, I know Linda's obviously very aware of it, and I know that could be something that could be discussed. I'm sure that you have another meeting probably already on the books with Dr. Hubbard and Dr. Fulton. I don't know. Okay. So.
Our next meeting is November 19th, which is the week before Thanksgiving. Again, my direct mind wants to just start mapping stuff out, but I don't want to get us off track, and I don't want to be bossy. So I'm just going to sit. But if there's anything that you guys want me to do or map or outline or think about, let me know, because, that's one strength I can bring to this team is trying to draft stuff in a process way, so.
Yeah.
I like what we have outlined so far on this, and I think it would be good to probably, in addition, if we can wrap that up on the 19th, start looking at, have there been surveys that were filled out for staff meetings? Maybe revisit BLT, the things we said we were going to do that I literally forgot about until you guys mentioned them again today, because there's so many other things. I have not. We've had one at North last week outside. We had an outside one, so we could talk about some things and all be
We have.
together. But I will talk to
We
Dr.
haven't
Higgins.
been, our BLT is working to develop our PD plan, so we haven't been having full staff meetings.
We've had just the one staff meeting and it was all about hybrid,
Are-
so.
Schools
I don't,
are asking, I've
Sure.
had a couple saying, oh my gosh, I totally forgot about this, we're starting, so even just as early as yesterday, someone said, hey, I feel like I've missed something, did I miss this? Yes, you did.
There are buildings, so where it is happening.
Yeah.
Principal, they are doing, they are getting feedback, and I think it's going to the BLT.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I know some people have reached out to me about, is this every, or, you know, and I'm like, if it's, my thought process when I was talking to my friend was, you know, if it's just a procedural meeting, you know, if you're doing PD and those kind of stuff, then
Then, yeah.
yeah.
And I
So
want to say thanks, Mike, for bringing that up during PDC.
Yeah,
I think that was
was
really
good.
great. It's nice that Jay and John and I are all on PDC, and so I appreciate you kind of giving us some space to kind of
Absolutely.
share. I thought that was really positive for me, so
Good.
I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Alrighty.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for everybody's time today.
Lindsay, I
Thank you,
copied you on
Stephanie.
the notes because I know you're a note keeper too. And
Perfect.
Rachel, I'm going to make you at some point quit apologizing to us because you're a go-getter and you're thorough and you're doing your job and you're doing it with transparency with this group. So,
Well, thanks.
you know, I just want to
Thanks,
recognize
Stephanie.
that for the group. It's not always easy, but
I just have this self-conscious that I'm gonna be the bad person because I'm an attorney and I don't know.
well, you know,
Well, that's
it's
just a
hard for you because
given.
that is your training, that is your expertise. You're always going to be zoning in on things that us non-attorneys do not, and it's got to be frustrating for you. But you know, it's just going to make this whole process tighter, and we'll work through it. There'll be times that you know Russ is going to like totally, you know, dominate about money. I'm thinking, maybe not. I don't know, but anyway, it's okay. I just wanted to say I don't feel like if you're saying sorry because of the process, you know.
Yeah,
You're-
thank you for that.
you know,
All right, have a good evening,
Okay.
Stephanie.
Thanks, guys.
Notes are out. Bye, guys.